Welcome, and I'm happy to see so many people this afternoon here in Brussels. Thank you for coming. My name is Michiel Boots. I'm Director General of Economics and Digitalization at the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy. And as you know, probably the Netherlands has been an advocate of an open internet for many years. It's something that's close to our hearts, something we're proud of. So I'm very glad that we are here today to discuss this and related issues with each other. We believe it's not just something that's crucial at the open internet for our economy, but also for European society, for our rights and freedoms. And I think that's something that is, we have all seen developments out in other continents in the past few years where we realize how important this is. And the debate that we're talking about today is not, I think, a sort of simplistic question of interests of, say, telecom interests perhaps against those of big tech. I think this is a much more complicated issue that we should delve into this afternoon, and we should look at what are sound policies that work best for European consumers, for European businesses. The Netherlands is strongly committed to the regulation of large platforms, of also addressing data power, and in particular the market power of the large tech companies. So it's not a question of being tough on big tech or being easy on big tech. As I said, it's a question of looking for sound policies to carefully analyze what is the problem that we need to address, and then to possibly come up with an evidence-based instrument. And that would imply an honest debate open to all stakeholders, which is why I'm very happy to see you here this afternoon, I think representing a very diverse group of companies, member states, and other interested organizations. In our view, what threatens to go wrong with this discussion, or at least in the debate that has been unleashed by the consultation, is that we seem to be starting almost with a solution, the network fee, without really looking at what is the underlying problem and whether that underlying problem requires a specific solution. And that's why we and several other member countries have sent letters to the European Commission to call for an honest, evidence-based debate and to carefully respect procedure. And that, again, is why we have invited you here this afternoon to this event to have a constructive dialogue with a broad range of stakeholders. It's also the reason why we asked Oxera to prepare a study on the impact of a possible network fee as a contribution to the debate, which we can discuss here this afternoon, open for all of you to challenge. And this need for an evidence-based approach is also why we contradict claims that are quite persistent, but in our opinion also unfortunately inaccurate. I'll get back to that later. I think they'll be dealt with in the discussions that will be coming up in the next hour and a half. We want to prevent the network fee debate making a false start. I think we have to go beyond, as I said, the simplistic frame of it being seen as big tech versus telecom companies. That's not a useful frame for looking at a serious policy issue like this. So we need to get away from that, and I think we need to get away from any potential polarization. Hopefully this event this afternoon can contribute to that positively and to the much needed evidence-based approach. Before going into the panel discussion, I would like to welcome Johan Ketelaar and Michael Weeks of Oxera, and they will give a presentation. They're both from Oxera, on the main findings of their report. Michael and Johan, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Michiel, for the kind introduction. And I'm happy to be here too today. Last time I stood here at this particular place was 10 years ago, when I was myself still at ACM, speaking about net neutrality and the first law about net neutrality, which was just adopted in the Netherlands, and that predated the open internet regulation as we know it. So it's good to be back here and to speak about the subject that Michiel just announced. Michiel introduced Michael already, Michael Weeks. We will do the presentation together. It will be a bit of a challenge because we have a report of about 45 pages and we have been given 20 minutes max to do this, so we won't go into the details of all the modeling. But we encourage people, if they have read the report, which I assume, and the people I spoke to just a minute ago said so, that they should reach out to us separately if they want to discuss matters in more detail. Because similar to Michiel, we would like to contribute to an evidence-based economically sound debate around topics as we are discussing today. I've been given an instrument which will be working. Yes, this is a scope in the outline. I'll skip this one. So the study, and again, this is also publicly available on the website of the ministry, so you can find it there if you haven't done so yet. It's important to speak a little bit about what's in scope and what's not. So when we spoke to the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy in the Netherlands, like a couple of months ago, we were asked to do an economic and a broader impact study on the proposal, which was brought forward by telcos and by ETNO, suggesting that content application providers, which I will call CAPs from now on, should contribute to telcos' network costs. We had a bit of a discussion about how we want to approach this, what the assumptions would be of this paper to have the best input for the broader discussions that would follow and that will follow in the future. And we focused out of that discussion on 3 basic building blocks that we will discuss with you today. First, we will look at the static welfare effects of introducing such a charge. Then we will look at the dynamic welfare effects. And thirdly, we'll look at the transaction costs that might come with the introduction of such a regime that should be taken into account if you are going to discuss the proportionality of such a regime. We deliberately abstracted from the existing open internet regulation, not because we don't like it or we want to deny that it's there, it's important, but we feel that for a purely economic analysis, we should abstract from it first, have that discussion, and then later on see how the open internet regulation relates to that framework. So that's important to bear in mind. And of course, the open internet regulation has economic elements in it itself, but it also has some other angles like fundamental rights, the way the internet functions more general. And I think it's perfectly capable of having those kind of philosophies next to the paper that we today present. And I'm sure that also the panel later on will talk about the interplay between the open internet regulation and the study that we have presented today. So like I said, we needed to work with a couple of assumptions because there's no formal proposal yet from the EU legislators, as we all know. And there's been quite a lot of references over the last half year in public speeches, in papers, so we had to work from that. And basically, we didn't use one particular piece of paper out there as the example of what the proposal would be. But we spoke again with the ministry about what the right approach would be. And when we did so, we found out that there were 3 main criteria that we needed to address beforehand if you were to think about introducing such a payment or charge. And by the way, I will say payment, charge, levy, and they're all the same meaning, different terms for the same thing. But it's people have been asking why we called it a levy. There's no particular thought about that, but we will use it in different ways today. So one of the criteria that you need to discuss beforehand to do such a study is about who should pay this contribution. Should it be all caps? Should it be a subset of caps? It's important to take that into account because it can lead to different outcomes. The other question is about how the payment would be structured. Would it be proportionate to traffic? Would it be another mechanism that would be introduced? Each of those things would have different implications potentially, so you need to take that on board too. Third one, equally important, or maybe even more important, who would be on the receiving end of the payments? Would it be all ISPs? Would it be just network operators, alternative operators, MNOs, MVNOs? From the proposals that were out there, it wasn't exactly clear, so we needed to work with some assumptions. So in the end, we decided, also because an all caps pay scheme, even conceptually it might be the right approach, would not be workable because we can never charge all the caps in the world to pay to a subset or all the ISPs. So we needed to make a decision there, which is also in line with what ETNO and the telcos were suggesting. So that was an easy one. So we focused on the largest caps pay scenario. And the other one is that we included the proportionate to traffic assumption in the way the fee should be calculated. If you look at who would be on the receiving end, we in first instance focused on network operators, so the ones owning the network, but not ignoring the fact that we have alternative operators, and these are important too. But we will tackle those later when we talk about the third building block, which is the transaction costs. So to do this study, you need to have some kind of economic framework. And I know that there's been a bit of discussion out there whether broadband markets could be seen as two-sided markets in the first place or not. But given the proposals that were out there by Edno and others, where the suggestion was that the market should be approached as a two-sided market, we took that one on board. And I think also it provides an excellent framework to do the calculations that Michael will present in a moment. So two-sided markets are interested, and they are interesting in for many reasons. They are all around us. We see them every day, all the platforms, newspapers, you name it, eBay. These are all two or multi-sided markets, and there's no specific rule whether this is good or bad. There are very good examples of two-sided markets leading to very good outcomes in terms of economic efficiency. But the broadband markets are different currently. Currently, the majority of the cost is paid by subscribers, as we all know. And that's not because there has been some kind of regulator mandating this. This is just the way the internet has evolved over the past decades. And so without regulatory intervention, this has been the equilibrium, you could say, that has been reached. That doesn't mean per se that if you take a forward-looking approach, that this will be the best approach going forward. So in that sense, I think it's very good to always look with a fresh pair of eyes to the markets and the challenges that everybody in the ecosystem is facing, whether this should be sustainable or whether you should consider other kind of payment mechanisms. So this is the framework that we took, and I will hand over to Michael now, who will present two of the three building blocks that I said, explained in my introduction, the static efficiency analysis and the dynamic analysis. And I will get back to you later after Michael has spoken on the transaction costs and conclude. Michael.
So thanks, Johan, for the introduction and context to our report. Before we look into some of the details of our analysis and our conclusions, I just wanted to first give a little bit more flavour to the three building blocks that Johan introduced. So firstly, on the static impacts, specifically we mean improvements in static consumer welfare. And we say that that depends on the extent to which the payments from the caps to ISPs will be passed on to consumers in the form of lower connection prices, and also on the extent to which there's any offsetting impacts on increases in prices on the cap side. Because in the absence of any pass-on, the payment is simply a transfer from caps to ISPs with no change in overall welfare. And we'll consider these static impacts in more detail through some illustrative calculations that we did in a report based on an economic model, which I'll discuss shortly. In terms of the dynamic impacts, this relates to changes in investment. So if there is increased investment from telcos in coverage or quality as a result of the payment, then that could bring improvements. But again, that would need to be weighed off against any potential negative impact on innovation or investment on the cap side as a result of the change. And finally, on transaction costs, they may come in part for the need for increased regulatory involvement. So while Johan will pick up on kind of what some of these transaction costs might be in a bit more detail, I first want to just highlight two particular examples. So first, an independent third party might be needed to facilitate the agreement in the first place. So given the imbalances in bargaining power between individual caps and ISPs, any bilateral bargaining between the two parties is unlikely to result in kind of an efficient or equitable outcome. So these charges might need to be set by a regulator. And secondly, in order to ensure that the contributions from caps do actually result in lower prices or additional investments where market dynamics might not necessarily have that effect, some form of regulatory oversight about how those funds to be used might be needed. So in terms of the static and direct welfare impacts, as I said, we've got a basic economic model that produces some illustrative calculations. And that model is abstracting from any indirect or longer term impacts such as investment in network capacity or content. We're focusing here at this stage just on the static welfare effects only. So the model results that we have need to be seen in the wider context of the broader context of the report and the other building blocks that we look at. Also, our model is by definition, by necessity, based on a number of assumptions, which are all set out in detail of our final report, so I won't cover them here, but as Johan said, feel free to pick up that with us separately. But even though our calculations are indicative, we do find that the overall results coming out of that are robust to various sensitivities that we apply to the different assumptions. So essentially the model is built to consider the net welfare impact changes across both the broadband and the content sides of the market. So on the internet connection side, the telco side, we show that the charge paid from caps to ISPs will be partially passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices via the waterbed effect. And that is representing a transfer from the caps to the telcos to the consumers. The transfers in themselves don't necessarily result in any additional welfare gain. However, those lower prices might lead to increased broadband consumption or take-up. So either in terms of more internet connections or people trading up to faster interconnections that than they otherwise would have adopted for. And that can lead to welfare gains to the extent that consumers are deriving welfare from consuming those extra units, and the ISPs get kind of extra profits from providing that. On the content side, or the cap side, we find that there may be instances where there is pass-on of this levy to customers in the form of higher prices. Now, the extent to which that will be seen in practice depends on the degree of competition those caps face, but also on the funding models. And in particular, where there is a subscriber-funded operation like Netflix, in that case, we're assuming that there is some degree of pass-on. And where that pass-on does take place, then there's a change in welfare and a transfer in surpluses, which is in the opposite direction to those I described on the telco side of the market. So again, whilst those transfers of surplus have no impact on the overall welfare, the higher price could lead to welfare losses as individuals reduce their consumption or the value, the surplus they get from consumption of the services provided by the caps. So our illustrative calculations essentially showed the trade-off between the potential welfare improvements on the telco side and the potential welfare losses on the cap size. And the overall welfare effect depends on that relative size of the waterbed effect on the one side and the pass-through percentage on the cap side. However, across all of the scenarios that we considered, with kind of adjusting some of the assumptions and different scenarios falling into this, we have a consistent finding that the potential welfare gains on the telco side are almost entirely eliminated by the welfare losses on the cap side. So the overall welfare change, in the static sense, is relatively modest. And the majority of what we're seeing here is just a transfer. So there might not necessarily be a clear economic rationale in terms of welfare improvement here, and the degree to whether this transfer is desirable is outside of the scope of what we're looking at here. That's not necessarily a economic issue per se. In terms of the having considered those static effects, we consider the dynamic effects, and this is where kind of advocates of the fair share levy suggest that some of this money could be used to network operators to invest in additional infrastructure or increase the speed or capacity of their networks. And the first thing to note is there is obviously a tension here, in the sense that €1 can only be used, that €1 can't be used to both pass on to consumers in lower prices and go to the investment. So the amount that can be used for investment is almost what is potentially left over from anything that would be passed on to consumers in lower prices. And furthermore, it's not necessarily clear that any increase in payments from caps would necessarily lead to further investment. And this is where we can refer to standard corporate finance or economic theory, which is suggesting that firms will invest in those projects where the expected returns exceed the cost of capital. And in this case, the cash payments from caps aren't necessarily going to have a significant reduction on that cost of capital, which depends on risk-free rate in market or returns on equity and debt investors. So, and there's no reason to believe that those things would change directly as a result of this policy. However, if the structure of the payments is such that there is a bounty attached to subscribers, so for every additional subscriber you get, you might have a greater payment from from the caps. And if competition for those subscribers is based on coverage and quality, then there may be an incentive for telecoms providers to make that investment in order to attract more customers. However, overall, from a dynamic welfare perspective, we say that unless there's a clear mechanism that mandates that those extra funds should be used for a greater investment, the additional investment effect is likely to be modest. And again, any dynamic benefits that would come from the investment on the telco side needs to be traded off against potential reduced incentives by the caps. So again, let's think about, for example, a streaming service. If they're obliged to contribute and their costs go up, they may have a lower incentive to invest in content, because that investment in content is intended to attract customers, and if attracting more customers leads to higher payments, then the marginal payoff of that investment in content is reduced. It's not necessarily just content as well. Caps do also invest in network equipment in order to reduce the bandwidth use and lower the cost of sending data. So if there's any reduction here in those level of investments as well, that might have an offsetting impact. So just to conclude, I think there isn't necessarily an economically sound reason for the levy when we look at the static and dynamic effects, because a proportion of the funds might be passed on to consumers in the form of lower price reductions and therefore not available to invest. The relationship between that cash flow and investment is weak, and any effects where there is greater investment needs to be weighed off against potential reductions on the other side. So I'll hand back to Johan now to cover the third and final building block.
Thanks, Michael. We still have a bit of time, right? Yeah, perfect. So Michael just presented the two building blocks, static and dynamic welfare effects. The third building block that I mentioned in my intro was about the transaction costs. These need to be taken into account as well, because if you were to introduce such a regime, you need to know what the impact of that regime is outside just the economic welfare analysis. And transaction costs, following economic theory, is just the time, money that you need to come to an agreement. And in this particular example, with the proposals that we've seen, it's important to dive a little bit deeper in what it would be, the transaction costs, and also what the role of the regulator, that Michael already mentioned, should be. And this should be set against the role of the regulator right now. And if you look at the markets that we are talking about right now, these are markets which are relatively low in terms of regulatory intervention. I mentioned it already in my intro. We've seen limited disputes. Again, this doesn't mean that this couldn't change in the future, but I think if you just look at the last 10 years, it's quite relatively low in terms of regulatory interventions. Whereas if you were to introduce this regime, there will be quite a number of tasks that will be new to the regulator, and also there will be, definitely in the beginning, a potential risk that there will be disputes, litigation, all those kind of things. That aside, there need to be also a role for the regulator, as we know it from the regulators, as they have done in the market reviews in the telco markets, where they need to get their facts right, because we're talking here about all kind of important assessments, the amount of traffic from one particular company versus that one of another one. How do you measure this? Is this reliable? There are potentially a lot of questions that you can ask about this. Then you need to potentially do cost analysis or price settings, dependent, of course, on the regime that you choose for, but it shouldn't be underestimated beforehand. Then, and this is the place where also the alternative telcos are coming into place, you need to think about the existing S&P, significant market power reviews. Obviously, if the payments were to go to the telcos that own the network, quite often these are the incumbent players who also face wholesale obligations. One way or the other, there's some impact of this regime, in whatever shape you propose it, on the S&P framework. So you should think what the implications would be. Do you need to reassess the market reviews? How do you deal with the alternative operators? That's one thing that could be potentially a lot of work. Then there is the potential distortion of competition. We don't know exactly what the charge will look like. But in the assumptions that we have done, like I said in the beginning, but also in what we hear from the industry, it should be a regime where some caps pay and some don't pay. And then at the borderline, there will be all kind of potentially competitive questions about why is somebody in and the other one out, and what is the effect on the markets where these companies are competing. A similar question could arise from telcos who themselves offer caps or caps-like services. What does that mean for competition? All these kind of things could potentially have distortive elements, and those need to be taken into account into the what we call transaction cost bucket. I'll come to the conclusions. I think we touched upon those 3 buckets already, but I will very briefly repeat them here and then allow for the panel discussion to take place. So if you look at the static welfare gains, Michael explained this, we see that the welfare gains that you there, if you look at both the cap side as well as the telco side, are relatively modest in our model. Once again, these are illustrative calculation. Don't go out there presenting them as the single source of truth. It's meant as a framework, but the conclusions on the other hand are pretty stable and robust. If you look at the dynamic welfare aspect, you again need to weigh between the effects on both the cap side as the telco sides. And Michael explained already whether there would be absolute guarantees that there will be money over to invest in the networks and where there would be a causal relation to do that. And then I ended with the transaction costs I just explained. They can be significant and should be taken into account in the overall assessment. Thank you for your attention, and we can take some questions right now, I believe. Just a few, I believe, and then during the panel, maybe some more. Yeah.
I'm hoping to moderate the panel discussion. Does anyone have any questions on the reports? Yeah. Any brave souls?
Maybe online?
We also could go to the panel and then ask questions at the end as well, because we've got, I know you both will come up at the end as well to answer some questions there.
Yeah.
Unless we have any questions from the audience? Or
Luke?
1
second, there's the microphone.
We've got a mic for you.
It's just a question for clarification. When you speak about the cash flows, and we say that there is empirical literature that shows that the cash flows have no impact on investment, could you more explain what you understand on those cash flows? Because it's a little bit weird to read that for me, because when we do a business case, you look at the cash in and the cash flows in, the cash flows out, and you discount them. So that's why it seems to be totally in contradiction with how you make a business case. So could you explain? Thank you.
I can. Michael was presenting it, but I'm happy to take it. But correct me if you want to add something, Michael. But I think what we want to make clear here is that if you would get more cash flows from, in this case, caps, it doesn't necessarily have a causal relation with the future investments telcos might do in their networks. If there would be a business case to invest already, the money would already be out there and accessible to subtract it. So there's no guarantee that the extra money that would come from caps would go there and might otherwise go to maybe shareholders or something else, right?
Awesome, thank you. Do you have any others? Right here in the front. The microphone's on its way. If you don't mind introducing yourself as well, too.
Rudolf van den Berg, Stratix Consulting from the Netherlands. I like your report. One minor nitpick. You guys chose a two-sided market approach. Fundamentally, I think that this market is not a two-sided market. Economists have chosen a two-sided market often because, well, one is a monopoly, two is a duopoly, but three is too difficult to model, and a real market with 5 or 10 just doesn't fit in the models anymore. But the reality is that in a two-sided market, there should be some platform benefits for both sides to be actually on the ISP's platform. But the ISP is not a platform. There is no benefit to be on one ISP more than another. It's not like a dating platform where certain types congregate or anything. So though it is very common in literature to model it as a two-sided market, I think it's fundamentally wrong, and unfortunately we'll probably never be able to kill it because so many people have written about it that it's now law for economists. But yeah, it's still wrong.
Thank you. Yeah, I can comment on that, Rudolf. I know your position, and I've read your statements about it, of course, and I can sympathize to a large extent. I think that what we try to present here is to give a framework, given the suggestion of this being approached as a two-sided market. And I think I made a remark in my intro statements already, where you can have like different views on how to look at broadband markets. I appreciate all the technical input that you give in the debate. I think it's important. But I think what we try to do here, similar to the ministry, is to give like an economic framework, to have like a balanced discussion about the overall proposals, and just like the internet, the open internet regulation is left out of scope. It's an important factor. I think that similar, your arguments that might be a little bit more of a technical nature, I think you should be taken into consideration if you were to take ultimate decisions about the policy proposal.
We're getting a bit of that flavor of debate already, which I'm sure in the panel discussion we'll really dive into. But thank you so much, Johan and Michael. And you'll be taking questions at the afterward as well at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
We can give them a round of applause. I should introduce myself. I am Jillian Deutsch, the technology reporter here in Brussels for Bloomberg News. I'm so excited to be hosting this conversation about fair share, network fees, whatever you want to call it, because that topic is clearly just exploding here in Brussels among the tech bubble. So I will shut up, though, as I have many, many questions for our panelists, so I would love to dive right into that. You've already met Michiel Boots. We have him coming up. Take the stage. We have Anne-Marie Sipsk from the BEREC co-chair. We have Stefan Lechler, who is the Deputy Head of Unit for DG Connect at the European Commission. Alessandro Grappelli, who is the Deputy Director General at NLatEU. We have Julia Iop, who is the EU Policy Manager at Sky on behalf of the VOD Coalition. And Claudio Teixeira, the Digital and Consumer Rights Specialist at Buick. Quite a large panel, very excited to have them. Give a round of applause. Now, I want to start off by maybe taking a step back, because I know a lot of the discussion in Brussels is already about what kinds of solutions are on the table here. But I think one of the questions so many of our panelists, and many in the room I'm sure already have an opinion on, is there even a problem to begin with? So I'm going to be a bit of a jerk and start you guys off with a yes or no question. Do you think there is a problem? Claudia, you want to start us off?
Is it good? Okay. No. I think we can be very concise
yes or no for now.
On this.
We'll definitely get into it.
I'm afraid I also have to say no.
It's the very question we're asking in our exploratory consultation.
We'll get to that.
If I have to go for a yes or no, I'll go for the no at the moment, but I still have an open mind.
Can I rephrase it into a challenge? I think we have a connectivity challenge, but I don't think we have I'm not sure we have a financial problem.
It's leaning toward no. We'll get to it.
With a straight face from the telecom industry, I will tell you no, there is no problem. Everybody is connected to 5G and fiber and everything is fine. We are all happy.
Interesting, okay. Well, Alessandro, I'm going to start you off, though, because that is one of the big debates, of course, is there a problem? They point often to this NLatEU report that was published last spring, I believe. Can you walk us through what it is you guys actually see is a problem and why you think there's a solution that the Commission needs to come up with?
Thank you, Gillian, and thanks a lot to the Dutch Ministry and the representation for inviting us and also for funding this report by Oxera. I think, looking a bit at the report and a discussion we got just now, the problem, I think that the essence of the digital decade strategy, which is how this European Commission decided to frame this mandate, is that Europe has an ambition, a problem, a challenge. We can define it in many ways, as Anne-Marie was saying. Bottom line, we want to bring the 450 million Europeans to have a full 5G and full fiber. Today, we asked Analysis Mason to check how many people will be connected to 5G and fiber in 2030, and they told us that 45 million people, if we continue investing at the pace of today, will not be connected. And notice that this estimate is generous because they did it based on numbers of investment, numbers of 2021, which is when interest rates were lower. So I don't know that we will keep everywhere in Europe this investment pace. And 45 million people, I did the calculation, is a country 2.5 times bigger than the Netherlands. So here we discuss EU policy, so I think that the challenge, as Anne-Marie was putting it, is real, is there, so there is a problem that we are trying to address. Looking at the Oxera report, I actually draw different conclusions, and I think that it supports in many ways how we, as ETNO at least, framed the debate. Also, I found that it resonates a lot with another report that is the only piece of academic evidence out now out there, which is Toulouse School of Economics, which, by the way, is where they created and won a Nobel Prize on two-sided markets a few years ago. And the Oxera report, to me, is in a dialogue with this piece of academic evidence in that it finds, first of all, that the costs that we have been told that don't exist actually exist. So there are costs there. And it also says in the Oxera report that if you introduce a fair contribution, these network costs indeed would be reduced by the introduction of the fair contribution. Also, Oxera told us, both in the report and in the presentation, that they expect that if the right regulation is written, these lower costs would benefit then consumers in terms of lower broadband prices. That's what's written in Oxera. And in Oxera, it's also written that advertising-based platforms will not pass on any cost, any price to consumers because, well, maybe they can hoard a bit more of our personal data, but they cannot pass on a price. It does say, however, that for some streamers, part of that cost can be passed on to consumer. However, I noticed that we all have an internet bill. Not all of us, however, have a streaming bill. I have 3, unfortunately, because I'm silly, but it's a bit different. So I think that these aspects alone should be enough from a public interest viewpoint to say maybe this should be debated, because there might be in it things that are good in terms of consumer welfare, which is, by the way, the conclusion of the Toulouse School of Economics. The consumer welfare gains are positive. That's where they got. So I think it's worth it that we have a discussion. Of course, I'm having the discussion because I represent telcos, but from a public interest viewpoint, I guess that if they tell you that there is some consumer welfare to be had, maybe the discussion is worth it. So I think that the Commission consultation is relevant. To conclude, our position, first of all, it is ETNO's position, but there is not only ETNO, gladfully, discussing about this. We got alternative operators who expressed their views. We got alternative operators who co-signed the letters with ETNO. We got Bouygues Telecom, who is a challenger. We got Fastweb, who is a fiber maverick in Italy. We got Breco, who is the anti-incumbent in Germany. And they all expressed, with different nuances, but a support for a fair contribution debate. And to me, and there I conclude, is the starting point is that the EU open internet rules are in the acquis communautaire. So it means that that is law that you need to respect. No blocking, no throttling, no discrimination. We got BEREC, that is the guardian of this. And I think, and I didn't hear a stakeholder in Brussels or elsewhere asking to change those policy principles right now.
I'm going to cut you off here because we've got a lot to get through, but we'll definitely get to this net neutrality question. Stefan, I want to go to you because, and we'll get to this consultation as well. But I think there's a consensus, or definitely sentiment among many in Brussels, that the Commission has already made up their mind. There is already a problem, but you emphasized in your answer it's an exploratory consultation. Has the Commission made up its mind about whether there's a problem or not?
So on Johan's slides, one of the first slides, the fact that there is no legislative proposal yet, in brackets. would delete the yet. There is simply no legislative proposal. Will there ever be one? I don't know. We launched a consultation. It's an exploratory consultation. It's one of the 3 types of consultations we have in our toolbox: public consultations, targeted consultations, and this funny animal of an exploratory consultation, which has never been used so far. It's the first time we use that. It means that we really try to find out whether developments in a market or somewhere warrant community action, whether there's a problem, and this is not related necessarily only to the fair contribution aspect. This is related to the question, as we raised in our consultation, about what networks do we need in the future. Not a snapshot of the past networks, not a snapshot of the current situation, the networks of 2030 and beyond, the convergence of satellite, 5G, 6G, fixed networks, the computing continuum, as our commissioner called it in Barcelona, where the blurred or where the line between connectivity infrastructure, computing power, edge computing, end user device becomes blurred, where the latency is significantly increased or reduced, in that matter of fact, to provide for all these new services in the future, AI, mobility, Web 4.0. So these are the questions which we raise as a bigger picture. If you look at our consultation, the fair contribution topic is 20 questions out of 62. So it's there, it's important, but it needs to be framed in the bigger question. What are the networks in the future? And are the telcos and other participants' business model fit for purpose to provide these networks of the future? These are the questions we're asking. The consultation runs until mid-May, 19th of May. We'll take stock, we publish everything, of course, and then we decide whether there's a problem or a situation that we might warrant by regulatory or other type of action. We don't know yet.
So how likely is it that we do not see any legislative proposal? We go through all of this work and then nothing comes out.
As I said, we need to take stock after we see the responses. And of course, there is this, since 2 years, this discussion of fair contribution. And this is one of the aspects. But as I said, it's the bigger picture. And let me remind you, all of your member states, since we are on the Dutch Perm Rep here, we have a commitment between the 3 institutions, the European Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. We have a commitment. It's a digital decade principles declaration. It's a solemn declaration. It's not a binding legal instrument. It is a political commitment. And the 3 institutions agreed in December last year, a few weeks ago, to establish frameworks to ensure that anyone who benefits from the digital transformation proportionally contributes to the cost of rollout of these networks. So that's a commitment which you have. It's also enshrined in slightly similar wording in a recital of a binding legislative instrument, the Digital Decade Policy Program 2030, where it was mentioned before, we have connectivity targets for 2030. So there's a commitment by the 3 institutions, obviously, to do something. So I'm just let this thought linger a little bit to remind everyone, including the member states, that there's this commitment.
Well, to this member state's commitment to do something, Michael, I want to ask you, because we're already seeing countries dividing into certain camps, right? The Netherlands has a very strong idea about where things stand. Germany also last week had some very interesting comments. And then on the other side, we see, France, Italy, Spain. They're in a very different camp. Why are you guys on such opposite ends already? And what do you envision in terms of trying to bring your other member states along into your camp?
I think it is good, I think, to look at the procedure, and we are in an early phase, an exploratory consultation, so that gives us all the opportunity to stake out our positions. I'm aware of the position of quite a few countries, but a lot of the member states, I think, haven't yet made up their mind. I think it is a complex issue. There are many sides to it, so I think it's good that we exchange our views on what the problems are, what the challenges are, and whether any instrument such as this should be considered. The whole goal of this meeting is, of course, to exchange ideas, but we're not the only ones doing such exchanges. I think perhaps we're a little ahead of the curve, but yeah, I'm not going to predict how many other countries will be in the same camp as we are. Perhaps we will find ourselves in exactly the same camp as countries that we at the moment expect them to be in a very different position. So let's just wait and see. It's a little bit early, I think, to make any forecasts.
Absolutely. So you're actually amenable. You might change your mind.
I think it's unlikely. I mean, we've staked out we've done quite a bit of research into this ourselves. We've also discussed this at a political level. I think that hasn't been the case in all countries. I think that's also part of it. But I think fundamental to an open consultation, exploratory consultation, is that we are open to new facts. I mean, there is fact-finding going on. I mean, these are markets in development. I'm also aware of that. So, yeah, I don't want to be too presumptuous.
Absolutely. To this question about facts then, Anne-Marie, I want to ask you, because this debate began end of spring. Everyone was freaking out here in Brussels. And then BEREC came out with their preliminary report, and it definitely poured some cold water, I should say, on the direction of travel. In that report, you guys said that it presents various risks for the internet ecosystem. There's no evidence of free riding from big tech. Direct compensation is not justified. It was quite a bold report. Are you convinced that there is, can anything change your mind to believe that there is actually a problem here?
Well, the report had this very, very complicated name. It was called a preliminary assessment of a contribution by CAPS to IP interconnection, if I have all the elements in the right order. And that is exactly what it did. We have been studying the IP interconnection market for quite some time, and at regular intervals we had been producing reports. And when, as you said, last spring this debate started with this first proposal to have some contribution from big tech, we thought this reminded us very much on our older work, and we decided to revisit that work. And to look at, do we see anything that changes our position from the one that we took in 2012 and 2017? And in that respect, we concluded that there were no reasons to revisit our position on IP interconnection. Well, IP interconnection is, of course, a very specific part of this broadband market. And it is there that we did not see any tremendous cost increase that actually... I don't think that IP interconnection is the market or the part of the market where we worry when we think about these connectivity targets. When we talk about the connectivity targets, or the so many more million people than will ever live in the Netherlands, I think, connected, it's the access network. But when you talk about IP interconnection, that's a whole different ballgame. That's one. So this is where our very strict conclusion on that particular technical point referred to. And the other thing is, I think on free riding, it is very important to have a good understanding of the whole ecosystem that we are creating here, all of us. The digital targets and the digital ambition, the digital rights and principles are not there because we want everybody to have this fiber sticking out of your house. That would be building empty cathedrals. It is, of course, to get people connected, to make sure that they can work, learn, entertain, reach out, do something. So there is a symbiotic relationship between content providers on the one hand and the other parties providing the connectivity. And you have to really think these relationships through. The moment that you think something is wrong and you want to edit or you want to add regulatory practices or regulatory intervention to make sure that everything you do has pros and cons and risks and advantages, and to make sure that you get it. And thinking in terms of free riding would be not doing justice to the whole system that has evolved. So if you think about, and this is where I think we have a challenge, but I'm not sure that inserting money at some point is per se the proper solution, but you really have to think through, how is this ecosystem really working, and are we sure that our intervention doesn't make things work or have adverse consequences that we regret later on? Absolutely. Now, I know Julia and Claudio have been very patient sitting here. I know you both are very critical of the direction of travel. I want to start with you, Julia, real quick. I mean, you've been in negotiations with telcos before. Can you elaborate a little bit on what those conversations have looked like? Have you guys felt like telcos are the small guys in those conversations?
Yeah, well, obviously the content of those negotiations are very private, so I'm afraid I can't say much on that. But I actually wanted to link to something that Marie, said about the symbiotic relationship, because this is what this is really about for us, VOD and streaming services. We already negotiate with the telcos. We have distribution agreements. That's how we get our content to consumers. And to challenge something Alessandro said, would you actually then get an internet subscription if you didn't have any content? Probably not. So we need each other in some ways, and we don't. So and that's why we work together, that's why we partner, and we have this agreement, so we don't see why this should be challenged. Not only in a lot of cases, and this goes back to a point that has been made by ADNOD and its members about there being some sort of imbalance in bargaining power in these negotiations. In most cases, we are actually the small guys when negotiating with some of these telcos, and a lot of them actually charge way higher prices for these interconnection or these agreements. So again, going back to your very first question, we don't see, again, what the problem is. We don't see a reason why to jeopardize this balance, this mutually benefiting relationship that we have as content providers with the internet providers. And one very last point, sorry to pick on you, Alessandro, but given the panel, that you said about alternative operators supporting your cause, as this talking with my Sky hat, is not all alternative operators. It was a very selective few members. I think that's important to point out because there have been a lot of smaller internet providers speaking against this and warning against the effects and the consequences on competition that imposing this internet tax would have.
Some of these keywords, the small guys, the negative consequences. Claudio, I mean, you're here representing consumers. I think often consumers are not really discussed in this conversation. What are your concerns about what this could lead to for consumers?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation for the European Consumer Organization to be here in this panel. Thank you to the Dutch Permanent Representation for this important discussion. And on that, I think you're absolutely right. I think consumers are dead at the center of this conversation, and somehow it's flown right past over us. And I think this is also a reflection of how this debate has been conducted so far in more macro terms, which is it hasn't been properly framed in the sense that if we do want to have a real discussion about how we should legislate at the European level, then the process should have been far more transparent from the beginning. And this is something that we've said from the beginning. I think that it's a shame, really, that the public consultation only came out now. I mean, we're very much happy that it did. This was, for us, essential that we should have a transparent, open process in order to have a real dialogue on what the problems are, if there is one. But indeed, I think the last 6 months, I mean, I think your expression of what's going on in Brussels, I mean, I think it's a reflection of that. I think a lot of this could have been avoided. And when we came out with a preliminary assessment back in September as BEUC, it was also preliminary assessment precisely because there was no proposal to discuss. There was just an intention to do something about something which wasn't really clear if it was a problem. And for us, it's a bit concerning that 6 months on, we're still not very much clear about if there is a problem at all, what really is the problem we're trying to address. I'm going to steal a soundbite from Jorn there in another event, which was, it doesn't look to us that there is a problem that needs a solution. It seems like there's a solution looking for our problem. And that's kind of the impression we've had so far. Our position on that has always been, let's listen to the regulator. Let's see what the regulator says. Let's see what BEREC says. They would have the capability to assess whether, if there is a problem, what it is and what is indeed the best way to address it. Even though a preliminary assessment, we do share a lot of the BEREC conclusions and the overall assessment that indeed there does not seem to be a need to regulate, to intervene in this market at this point. We think that when it comes to intervene at this point in this market, it would indeed cause some severe disruptions in the sense that, from our perspective, it would definitely cross, or indeed stand to cross, red lines that we have as consumers. And the two main red lines we're concerned so far is indeed, no matter how much we've been hearing it from some sides of the debate, net neutrality, the potential that indeed, I mean, again, maybe also the fault of how the debate has been framed in a so broad way, sure, but indeed that so far we haven't really heard any convincing arguments that such an intervention, no matter the modalities in which are being discussed, could indeed lead to violations of net neutrality. Because indeed, it takes more than just to have a law in force to make sure there are no violations of said law. And the second is the effects on competition. Not just in the telecoms market, but on the downstream markets as well, and potentially the effect on digital markets. I think at a point where the digital policy is such in focus in Brussels, this can indeed send complete different signal when it comes to the right incentives to the market. So I think at the end of the day, this is exactly the point, which is for consumers, there is not just an assessment of a problem. There is indeed no certainty so far that an intervention will not leave us worse off. And all the examples that are coming out and all the studies, and most importantly, not just Oxera, but also the only example we've heard so far of a country adopting similar measures, has left it very clear that consumers in the end are the ones who stand to lose out, not just with higher prices, but most importantly, higher prices for less quality, for less content, and worse consequences in the ecosystem as a whole. So at this point, we're not saying that we're completely against the proposal that comes on this sense. All we're saying that what we're hearing so far, it's a very, very high threshold to meet, and we're not really convinced that any proposal in which way, shape, or form is being put out does it indeed cross these two red lines we have.
I think we're all kind of dancing around this consultation that has been quite a topic in Brussels. I'm going to ask each of you a question. But before, I just want to let the audience know that I will open the floor to questions about 10 to 15 minutes, so do think of what your questions are. But I'm going to start with another challenge. This consultation came out. In one word, how would you describe how you felt reading the consultation? Alessandro, I'm going to start with you. One word.
It's comprehensive and...
Comprehensive,
Can you hear me?
That's great.
Comprehensive. Sorry, I don't have enough vocabulary. I would have liked it to be more precise. It's not precise enough on the data part.
Imprecise.
As a regulator, I'm a data
you
girl.
Want the data, yeah.
And it's too broad on the data part.
Broad and precise.
In a way, I would say it's premature. I understand that this is a novelty, an exploratory consultation. We were surprised. Obviously, haven't seen this before, and it's fully within the rights of the Commission to use this instrument. But had very much a feeling, which was just described as the solution looking for a problem. And I would much prefer to first delve deeper. Well, as Anne-Marie said, the challenge that we face, because there is a challenge, of course,
That's
to roll out.
more than one word, so I want to cut you
I
off. Sorry, I'll get back to you.
Fall into repetition.
I promise. Stefan. We'll definitely get to you on this consultation.
I'd like to respond.
Sure, yes, absolutely. We'll come right to you.
I'm afraid I also have like 3 words actually. Like it has assumptions, so I'm not sure how I would say. Because I don't want to say bias, because that's maybe a bit too strong. But just
you see Stefan's face.
Exactly.
And Claudio?
I would say unease.
Unease. Thank you for the one word. Okay, Stefan. There are a lot of comments here. Take some time to respond to them. Do you feel like this consultation is kind of presuming too much or lacks data or?
I think in the exploratory consultation, it's important to call it like that. Public consultation consults on a concrete proposal, on a roadmap. This is not consulting on anything. It's consulting about the future. That's why it cannot be said it's not transparent, because this is here where the transparency starts. It started on the 28th of February. So there's nothing before. The absence of something is not proof that something is hidden happening. So I think the allegations you made is quite strong, and I think they are completely non-founded. So we start the discussion here with the exploratory consultation. We dig in to see whether the topic which has been raised by Adno 2 years ago on certain causes, also there's something which I think we should discuss, is the fact that it's assumed as if there had never been any payments between caps and telcos before. Of course there are payments. There's currently in the Landgericht Bonn, 200 kilometers from here, is a court case exactly about that, where one large cap stopped paying after many years of paying based on a contract or the alleged contract, and the court has to decide how much needs to be paid, if at all. So these issues are already pending since years. So that's, this is something which has been missing in the discussion so far. The other aspect on data gathering, consultation is never a data gathering tool. It's not a request for information. The Commission doesn't have any legal power to request information. NRAs and BEREC have that. It's Article 20 of the European Electronic Communications Code. They could have asked these questions years before already, since the code at least. We don't have that, and it's a public it's a consultation where it's voluntary, and people are not bound to tell the truth. You cannot rely on the data. They can send data, they can send false data, it's not sanctioned. It's not like a DG Comp or another request for information where companies need to provide data correctly and must not be released, otherwise you're being sanctioned. We don't have that tool, it's a consultation. So we have to take this with a grain of salt. That's why we have to be careful on trying to get empirical data with a consultation. A consultation is giving you a flavor of something, where there's issues which might need to be investigated further than with a study, or with us asking BEREC that we invite basically to contribute and maybe to challenge the results which you might get from certain of this data, to check with the powers of Article 20 whether these data are correct or not. So this is the beginning of a process. Whether something will follow up afterwards, we simply don't know at this point. But the other argument, I'd like to come back to the consumer side. Net neutrality. Sorry, I don't intellectually understand this argument. We have a regulation in place since 2015, applicable since 2016. There is now a commitment by, again, I mentioned it before, in the Digital Decade Declaration by the three institutions, by the co-legislators, to support the principle of net regulation, not to change it. Nobody in this room or in the stakeholders among the member states has expressed an interest to change the regulation. So I don't understand why you question the principle of net neutrality. The mere fact that in case, as a working hypothesis, should there ever be an obligation of caps to pay telcos, and if they wouldn't, that a telco would have the right to infringe net neutrality regulation as a retaliation measure is absurd. It's completely absurd. You have to follow rules. If you don't follow them, you're sanctioned. If you want to ensure that you get your rights, you go to court. We're not in some revenge movie of Charles Bronson or something. This is the state of the law in the European Union. You cannot enforce your rights by infringing your obligations. And the fact, and I mentioned this particular company in the country I know best, based actually in Bonn, they didn't get paid anymore. Did they block or throttle that particular SCAP traffic? No, they went to court. That's how you do it.
Stefan, I want to ask you though, because you say this consultation is to kind of get a flavor of the debate, to get a sense of what the topics are, what the concerns are. I feel like we've already been having this debate though for 9 months at least, and plenty of people already have positions. Do you expect anything new in this consultation that will change your mind or change the direction of travel?
Well, the discussion so far has been dominated by two camps, but we wanted to open this. This is not about two camps. It's not about the video streaming, the entertainment content, and the telcos, which have to pay for more volume on their networks. This is not about this. As I said many times before today now, this is about the future networks, the demands of the future. It's not about video or entertainment. This goes beyond. This is the bedrock of the future wealth creation in the European Union, is the connectivity infrastructure. If you get it there wrong, if we don't have performant networks in the future, we can forget about the rest. So this is enshrined, and it's nothing new, it's enshrined in the Digital Decade policy program. And now is the question, what needs to be done? Maybe the telcos need to wake up, maybe other participants of the sector need to wake up to adjust or to at least question whether their business model might need to be revised in the light of these challenges in order to reach these goals, in order to be ready also beyond 2030. So that's why we try to trigger this moment and get everyone to think, and that's why we, to answer your question, we don't want to hear only from the usual camps, so to speak, but from everyone and their grandmother. It's open to everyone. The retired teachers, the professors, everyone can share. End users, you and me, which have experience or none with networks. But of course, we expect data, particular, even though with the caveat that we might not get too much evidence, empirical evidence, from the ones who run networks or use them. But in principle, it's also addressed to end users. We have a section on universal service, a section on end user challenges, because inflation, other aspects lead to higher prices to end users. It's obvious. Is the universal service regime as we have it still fit for purpose? All these aspects are there. Don't only read the last 20 questions on fair contribution, read the entire 62 questions.
I've got questions for all of you. I know Claudio really quickly wanted to jump in here, and then I'm going to give a question to Anne-Marie, okay?
Thanks. Just to get a quick right of reply, I think. Well, Well, first of all, thank you so much. It's great to hear the commitment of the Commission to net neutrality. It's great to hear right here and now that net neutrality will not be affected. From the consumer side, I'm much more reassured right now. I just wanted to say one thing, which is, it's not just the consumer perspective. It's the position of tremendously the concern and the position of tremendously the majority of stakeholders who've spoken about this issue, not just the consumer side, which is that until this point, they have not received any assurances that in measures like the ones that Etno has been proposing, which is, for better or worse, what's on the table, like the Oxera report all pointed out. We need to start somewhere, and so far the premise has been there. On their side, we don't see how a direct payment from caps to ISPs would actually result on anything I'll touch on net neutrality. It's not just me saying, it's not just consumers saying, it's the overall majority so far of the stakeholders that have spoken on this process.
Thank you,
So,
Claudio.
just to say, I don't think all of these people can be saying an absurd thing all at the same time. I think it's a valid concern and it should be listened to. But just one more point, which is, I think when it comes to debating what a proposal is and saying what the consultation has honestly gave the opportunity for everyone to contribute, I think at the same time, let's be said, when the consultation has a lot of the key questions which are only directed to telcos and big tech, and then say that you see more than two sides, well, we would love to have the consultation to actually indeed see more than those two sides on some key issues, because a lot of us as stakeholders would like to give more contribution and more input on a lot of these key issues that we're debating here when it comes to the fair share. Thank you.
I want to go to Anne-Marie because, Stefan, you raised a really interesting point about data. And I guess, Anne-Marie, how do you get independent, unbiased data?
Well, as the Commission rightly pointed out, we all have mandates and we can all ask the operators within our specific remits as individual NRAs to give us information, and that information has to be correct and validated. And what we do at BEREC is make sure that we have a consistent way of asking all these data, because we do have all these 27 EU countries, 38 NRAs member states in total. And then what we usually do is we collect data in a consistent manner so that we actually do have a European view, but also make sure that we all understand the differences and nuances that we have. And I do think that one of the good things, the fact that there is now this consultation or questionnaire out there, is that we actually try to get a bit less polemic and a bit more substance to this debate, because I do think that we all really, I was really ready for some more substance instead of, I think he said that and I think you meant that, and then, well, everybody felt misunderstood the whole time and misappreciated and everything. And for us as regulators, getting the data out there and and then have a second look at, okay, so what is now the analysis? And then still you can disagree on what problem is the most urgent to address, and also what is the best way to address it. But I do think the next phase should be a bit less fact-free and a bit more evidence-based. And I fully understand that an exploratory consultation has to be exploratory, so you have more open questions and less definitions. But I do see a risk of still trying to compare whole fruit baskets, apples, oranges, bananas, the whole thing. So in that respect, I know that we at BEREC are really happy if we can sit down with the Commission and say, okay, can we have some more specific themes that you want us to do our work? Try to get out there and get some data that will really help inspire any future steps you might want to think about. Because I do think that, as I said, a little less debate, a little bit more empirical basis would, I think, go a long way in this respect.
Absolutely. I have a question for Alessandro and Julia, and then I'm going to open the floor to questions. Alessandro, I know you've been keen to jump in here, but I also do want to ask, this net neutrality question is constantly being raised. I know you constantly say net neutrality is not even a question here, it is, it'll be preserved, but there are some legitimate concerns, I think, that are being raised. How do you envision this actually playing out where it doesn't even touch net neutrality?
Yes, and I would like to take the opportunity to respond to your net neutrality point, to the scope discussion, who should pay, to the beneficiaries discussion, who gets this money, and to the accountability discussion, because these were, in my view, what I heard is all very valid worries that it's good that we are discussing now. So, on your net neutrality point, the principles that are already in law, so if you break them, you go to court and you pay a fine. They are no blocking, no throttling, and no discrimination, meaning you cannot prioritize the traffic of the big tech guys that pay you to the detriment of those who cannot pay you, okay? These are the principles. Fair contribution, how we understand it as ETNO, would not infringe any of these three. And this leads me to the scope. So what is happening here, and what also Oxera discussed, there are regulatory costs probably to fair contribution, but there are also regulatory costs to the current open internet rules, and we are carrying them because they were the result of a democratic debate that said we need to protect the consumer and competition. We are now in a regulatory certainty situation in which we carry these costs. But this means that in the internet traffic market, one side, the telcos, are regulated, and the others, the big tech, are not regulated as to that specific point, okay? So there are things that we cannot do because law tells us you cannot do those things, and we will not be able to do them in 10 years or in 20 years because it's law, while others are right now not told what they can and they cannot do in that part. So to me, the scope is, and to ETNO and to also other colleagues in the industry, is let's look at those users that are not like the proverbial grandmother or grandfather, but they use the network in a very specific way that has a specific impact on the network and on how you manage it and on how you maintain it. And that, in our view, justifies the regulation. Very quickly on the beneficiaries and the accountability, because that's what I heard also from colleagues here. Of course, it cannot be only the big ones. Of course, and that's why I mentioned some of the companies we are talking to that are not incumbent operators, and that's why we get a lot of interest on this topic from many people outside the incumbent world. By the way, the smaller you are, the more difficult for you it will be as an operator to sit at the table with some big tech companies. If the case of the big German incumbent mentioned earlier shows us that even a big German incumbent has a problem in negotiating, imagine what it means for a smaller telco. That's why the small guys also in our field, in many cases, are interested. Last point is on accountability. Okay, you get that money. What do you do with that? Now, I think you will find openness in ETNO to discuss accountability mechanisms. If the point is, let's make sure that it goes to access networks, Marie was saying, the last mile, the 5G, what empowers the user, let's discuss what these accountability mechanisms are. We have already a lot of precedent in European legislation as to how telcos as well use their money. So if there needs to be a discussion, because what we are looking at, I imagine from the public interest viewpoint, is consumers, let's have the discussion. So full openness from my side on scope, beneficiaries, accountabilities, and also on net neutrality.
So just a quick follow-up. I mean, would you be okay then for if the commission came out and said, actually, we're not going to go with this direct negotiations, we're actually going to go with a government a fund that is overseen by the government, and that money is doled out to telcos for very specific use cases. Would you guys be okay with something like that?
I would like still there to argue for the direct payment for one reason. When we started the discussion on full 5G and fiber, we said that 90 to 95% of the investment needs to come from the private sector and the rest from the public funds. Maybe with the recovery fund, let's say that now it's more 90-10. If you do the direct payment, you're acting on the 90% of the cake. If you do the public fund, you're acting on the 10%. So what is more transformative probably is on direct payment. But even on direct payment, you need accountability, because we are aware that that's what we are discussing. We are discussing that this money needs to flow in the right direction, needs to flow towards investment. And that was also a comment done by Oxera. Depending on how the law is designed, you can have a bigger positive effect or a smaller positive effect in terms of net welfare. So if there is a discussion to be had on how do you make sure that in our view, in the context of the direct contribution, that money goes in the right place, it's okay. Still, as Ethno, we will argue for the commercial solution rather than for the public fund. But again, this shows that there is a discussion to be had on how to do it so that it's in the best interest of the users ultimately.
Very quickly, Julia, I've been wanting to ask you this question because I know so much of the conversation often turns into this big telco versus big tech kind of question. You have a very interesting perspective, though. There are also other people who could be impacted by this, too. Are we going to see fewer European language TV shows possibly from this, or?
Well, that's the risk, right? And that's exactly what we want to avoid. And that's why I agree, with Alessandro, it's important to discuss this, but it's also important to frame this debate in the right way. Again, I think even Breton himself said it in Barcelona last week. It's not just about big tech and big telcos. The broader industry would be impacted, and especially the audiovisual and streaming companies. Again, Breton and even Vesager, I believe, said it now explicitly. We would probably end up falling directly within the scope of this contribution tax, whatever we want to call it, because of the nature of our service and the fact that we offer content directly to consumers. And that means, well, the potential consequences of that is that if we have to pay a tax to large telecom companies, we would have less money to invest in content, especially if you take into account the already hefty content levies and investment obligations that we have to comply with across Europe, which in turns means that we will be able to produce less content. So as you said, less, especially European content. We won't be able probably to do the next Borgen or the big European shows because we have less money to do so. And that in turns means less content, less quality content, and who loses ultimately from that? The most consumers. So again, this whole chain is just an example of how it's really not just about big tech, no matter how it's been framed so far. There is no way the consequences, the impact will be felt only by this, how many they are, big companies. But European businesses in the audiovisual sector, because obviously I'm talking on behalf of streaming companies now, but would definitely have an impact, and their consumers.
You're going nuclear if you're threatening Borgen.
Yeah.
But, anyway, for the audience, I know there's a question right here. We have a mic somewhere traveling. Just 1 second. I also believe that those watching online can ask questions too. So do feel free to ask your questions. We have a first question over here.
So first, let me introduce myself. I'm Luc Hendricks. I'm the Director General of ECTA, the European Competitive Telecommunication Association. So we represent the competitive forces in Europe and the alternative operators. And before my question, I have to say a couple of things. So the first thing is that our biggest member is Iliad. Iliad serves 10% of the Europeans today. So I would ask to be careful when saying small player, big player. Of course, if you compare that to Deutsche Telekom, it remains small. But compared to the Belgian incumbent or the Dutch incumbent, we speak about higher or similar sizes. So that's an important thing. Then coming to the question on, is the questionnaire, what is your feeling? We are disappointed with the questionnaire. And let's not make from this debate a smoking screen to kill the European model. Because there are certainly issues to be discussed. There is issues with sustainability, with our carbon footprint and also on. But they have three things that have, but it's important to mention it, 3 things that have been mentioned, that have been published: the recommendation, the Gigabit Act, and the questionnaire. The recommendation is highly problematic more than the discussion and the questionnaire, because it's really going to kill competition. It has been done in an undemocratic and untransparent manner by the Commission, and all the Democrats in this room should worry about it. With it, the Commission overrules the code that has been discussed with the co-legislator. Now, to be quick, come to my question. So if you look at the questionnaire, why are we disappointed? Because we lack the vision. We have spoken about the objectives of the digital decade. The most important objective there is to allow all the other sectors of the economy to achieve their green transition, to achieve the digital transition, and to be competitive in the digital world. That's the issue for Europe.
I'm sorry, you have to get to your question, because there are other people who want to ask it.
The telecom layer, and my view there is to the Commission and to the Dutch representative, what is the vision for you have between now and 10 years, or all the telecom sector will look like? Will it be a vision that is somehow seen by Breton as 4 big companies, or we will still have a diversified offer that will be able to serve the operators. And I ask the same questions to the Dutch representative for the simple reason, in this vision of 4 big operators, how do you see the role of operators like KPN? Thank you.
Quite a lot to answer there.
Maybe I start. We're asking these questions. We're asking whether if you want to merge, if you want to consolidate cross-border, are there any barriers? We don't say you should. We're asking because we have the aim of a single market, not only telecoms in another aspect, single market, and we're asking for, are there any barriers? And if so, which ones? So we're asking a lot of questions, 62 questions altogether. None of them are predetermined. We really are open question. I mean, there's a multiple choice, and you can also upload papers, you can provide additional ideas, etc. So I don't think you can argue that this is biased or that you're disappointed with these questions. We're really starting from a white, blank canvas, so to speak, asking about the question of the future of connectivity infrastructure. This is not all about the various targets of the digital decade. We're picking out right now this discussion on connectivity infrastructure for various reasons, for the geopolitical aspects, the critical infrastructure aspects, redundancy aspects, security aspects, and also, of course, we cannot ignore the fact that almost since 2 years there's this fair contribution debate, which almost got hysterical to a certain extent in the public, at least in the published opinion. So it was a time that we get some structure into this, discuss with everyone, open it up to all circles, as I mentioned before, to everyone and their grandmother, literally. So how can you say that this is disappointing? I mean, we're asking all these open questions, focused on connectivity infrastructure, not on content, not on skills, not on transformation of business, but on connectivity. But that's where we want to start right now.
Michael,
yeah, it's a very open and big question. I can't answer that in a few sentences. I'm also not going to put a number on how many telecom operators is a healthy competitive environment. In Holland, we have 3. Other countries, it's 4. I mean, it's for the regulators to determine that, so I can't really go into that.
So, other questions from the audience? Yeah. Oh, you've got it. Yeah. Sorry, if you want to bring the mic here. It's right here.
With regards to what's going on in Germany and what the Commission said about it. If we look at how Deutsche Telekom behaved over the last couple of years and its network capacity and how it has charged various networks, during COVID, it needed a 100 gig link to Deutsche Forschungsnetz because it had 20% packet loss on its network to Deutsche Forschungsnetz. It didn't want to upgrade, it didn't want to pay the €5,000 necessary to get a 100 gig link. Instead, it made Deutsche Forschungsnetz pay for transit. This wasn't done by Vodafone or Telefonica or any of the other German ISPs. So when you say that big tech paying to Deutsche Telekom is an example of the debate, I would ask you to look at all the smaller German networks who are forced to pay to Deutsche Telekom. And in the Netherlands, we had the same experience.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. So how do you evaluate that? Also, given that when Deutsche Telekom routed all Dutch traffic from T-Mobile Netherlands through Germany, it couldn't handle the traffic load because it didn't build enough capacity, but it used it to extort money from other networks. The lack of capacity. How do you see that?
Well, the telecoms regulatory framework applies to providers of electronic communication networks provided to the public. So anyone who is not a telco does not have rights to interconnect, to transit agreements, to peering. This is only between telcos. So if, in the past, and we know only of this case, which is now pending at court, because this market of peering has never been regulated. It's been going on since decades, even before the liberalization of the market in '98. This is something between carriers. If you're not a carrier, you are depending on the goodwill of a telco, because you don't have joint frameworks which join you in negotiation. There's no right to interconnect between a non-telco and a telco. That sometimes people forget. So if you have, for certain reasons, which might be a win-win technical win-win situation for both sides. You have agreements which some people call IP peering, others say no, this is some sui generis contract between a particular telco and a CAP. Then this is done for two interests. The CAP wants to know a certain quality level, that they don't suffer vis-a-vis their end users because the wheel of death, is loading, etc. They know that their traffic handover is handed over at a particular point of presence, let's say in Frankfurt in this case, and the telco has the benefit of knowing exactly how much traffic likely they will get from the particular CAP, so it can plan to dimension the network and the infrastructure. There was a technical, interesting symbiotic relationship. That's why some large CAPs and some large telcos do that. This is maybe similar to a content delivery network. So this is a fact pending in the court, Landgericht Bonn. And then there was this disruptive moment where for some reason in the June, but I know from the press, 2021, this particular CAP stopped paying. They stopped paying, but they still received the same service of termination services of data by the telco. And the telco did not block or throttle or limit the traffic. They didn't infringe net neutrality. However, they went to court and complained that they say they have a contract and would like to get paid for the service they provide to that CAP. So there's a contractual service dispute pending at the German court currently. So this is what I referred to when I referred to in the beginning that this was, in my view, a little bit missing maybe in the Oxera study, that they start from the premise that as if there have never been any payments between CAPs and telcos. The fact is, since we know, at least since this court case, yes, there have been payments, maybe not between the small CAPs and the telcos, but there are certain payments, call it IP peering, termination agreements, whatever, on handing over the traffic in the network in a particular point of presence of a large telco, because quite a few of the CAPs, at least the large one, they own huge networks. They're not provided to the public. This is self-provision. They run undersea cables, they run backbone networks. And if they would not be self-provided, they would be considered an ECN provider under the code. And then they would have legal rights and obligations to negotiate interconnection. And they would fully fall under the regulatory oversight of an NRA. However, since these networks are fully self-provisioned, they're not falling under the scope of the European telecoms framework.
No. We've got some questions online as well, so I'm going to bring the mic back. But I do very much appreciate the enthusiasm in this room.
Yes, there is a question by Christian Borggreen. Would big telcos be open to pay its fair share to pay for the content and applications data which they get for free and sell access to?
It's a very pointed question. Will big tech pay for their fair share? I don't know if anyone wants to take that. Yeah?
It's a joke. It's from Christians.
Good.
Well, that's not, I don't that's a joke. That's not a real answer.
I can expand on the answer on this. I looked a bit at the numbers, if we are to take seriously Christian's joke, and I liked how Oxera framed this double-sided market, two-sided market discussion. And I've read what they wrote, and I also read what Toulouse School of Economics wrote. My understanding from both Oxera and from Toulouse School of Economics is that the relationship is indeed symbiotic, but right now one part in that relationship is regulated under open internet rules and has a duty to carry the traffic of the other. The other part of the relationship, as far as this traffic is concerned, has no economic incentive via regulation to handle that traffic. So we are discussing about content, we are discussing about cool content, we were seeing it before, that people want, and that's why they take up also fiber and 5G connections. By the way, in South Korea is the biggest growth market for Netflix that has just announced 32 new production in South Korea, so it shouldn't be that hell place that is described by, sometimes by some. But there is also traffic pushed to users that the users don't demand. And I'm thinking, for example, of all the advertising models. So what we are saying now, what our pitch is as telcos, is that in that symbiotic relationship in which one part is regulated and the others isn't, there is an interlocutor, which is the tech company that currently has no real incentive to handle traffic properly. and the ones who need to manage that traffic is us, and the ones that build the capacity for that traffic is us. So we would simply like that symbiotic relationship that we acknowledge exists to be more balanced. That's what we are asking.
I know Claudio briefly wanted to respond as well, and then I think we are actually very out of time.
Yeah, very quick. I think this is a very good question indeed, because when people keep talking about net neutrality, I think this is for us one of the instances where I think the Auxerre report mentions exactly that, which is the negotiating capacity that is given to one of these parties and the consequences of it. Indeed, what happens if big tech or whoever is covered by this, because again, there's no proposal, whoever is covered by this, if they refuse to pay, what are the potential consequences? But more interesting, like the Auxerre report says, what happens to the ones that do pay? What happens when we do have big parties that are paying, we don't know how much, large traffic generators, isn't it? What happens when these pay, let's say, substantial amounts of money and everyone else, rights holders, publishers, small streaming European companies don't because they don't meet that threshold? I mean, all of a sudden we have these large platforms paying lots of money for access to the internet and those that don't. That creates an imbalance, and for us, it's actually very concerning, or very much, let's say, likely, or at least potentially likely, that we would have then what? Faster access, maybe internet premium, so that Netflix can continue apparently growing so much in South Korea that they're apparently complaining about South Korea. Fast access to ones faster than the others. That's an incentive for discrimination of traffic. And all the way down, this can hurt net neutrality as well. And even the Auxerre report notices this. So the fact remains that by creating direct payments, like Sunrise you're arguing to us, is indeed an incentive to these behaviors down the line. And these behaviors could potentially violate net neutrality. Again, we can very much argue that this can be taken to court, this can be solved in a different way, but the fact that we are even debating measures that can create an incentive for this to happen, I think this is something that should concern all of us. And indeed, concerns not just consumers, for once for sure, but also the vast majority of stakeholders who we've seen the current positions out there.
Thank you, Claudio. Now, I think we could debate this for literally hours. I think the Dutch are going to have to host a much longer, day-long event, at the very least, next time. I'm going to hand the mic back to Michael, but I just also wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists, for everyone for watching as well. I'll take it away.
Yeah, I'm going to keep it very short. I want to thank you all for coming. I think this is the fact that we've run out of time and that there are so many questions still left unanswered shows that it's we have a lively debate still ahead of us, and I'm very grateful for all of you for coming here this afternoon. And I think it's clear we're all committed to the goal of a thriving internet ecosystem, and we all, I think, underline that requires a very healthy, state-of-the-art digital infrastructure. So I think we have a very strong common interest, and let's continue the dialogue. And obviously with all our colleagues who also aren't here today, with the Commission, with all the member states and other involved partners. So thank you for coming, and I'm sure we shall see each other soon. Thank you.
Absolutely.